The gavel cracked like thunder and the courtroom exhaled, and the guarded survivor said, "The sound never ends in my head." The warm comforter leaned close with a steady voice and said, "Breathe with me and count to 4. The steady anchor stood behind the rail and said, "The process is messy, but truth survives pressure." The guarded survivor gripped the table and tasted copper, and she said, "Truth drowns when no one throws a rope." The velvet blade watched from the front row and smiled politely, and she said, "Justice is patient when evidence is thin." The judge read the verdict, and the letters felt like winter teeth. The reluctant fire starter slid a folded note into the aisle and said, "You are chasing the wrong shadow." The warm comforter steadied the guarded survivor's shoulder and said, "We will appeal, and we will endure." The guarded survivor felt a scent of graphite and a ghost of humming, and she whispered, "He used to tap his pen like that." The memory rang like a bell from years ago, and the lingering memory seemed to grin from a photo, and the guarded survivor said, "I hear you, and I will not look away." The hallway smelled of wet wool and lemon polish, and the guarded survivor said, "I hear the verdict repeating like a bad hymn." The warm comforter guided her toward the dull light and said, "Out here the air belongs to you." The steady anchor kept pace a step behind, and he said, "We file motions at sunrise, and we hold the line." The reluctant fire starter lingered near a bulletin board and said, "You want new facts, not old hope." The guarded survivor studied the folded note and said, "Whose handwriting shakes like this?" The velvet blade paused by the water fountain and said, "I admire persistence, though it so often breaks the brave." The warm comforter steadied the paper and said, "Let us read it somewhere quiet." The guarded survivor imagined a pen tapping a rhythm from years before and said, "He tapped when he solved puzzles, 3 short beats." The steady anchor opened the stairwell door and said, "Down 1 flight, no cameras, better privacy." The reluctant fire starter watched the exit route with a quick glance and said, "You always plan escapes like a map you never forget." They took the stairwell that smelled of iron and damp concrete, and the warm comforter said, "In still places the next step reveals itself." The guarded survivor held the note like a fragile bone and said, "If I open this, I may not close my eyes tonight." The steady anchor checked the landings and said, "No footprints fresh, we are alone for now." The reluctant fire starter leaned on the rail and said, "He used to wait here when the lights were broken." The guarded survivor felt the hum of old fluorescents and said he hummed to keep fear from talking. The warm comforter reached for the fold and said, "Let the fear speak and finish the sentence." The velvet blade's voice floated down from above like silk, and she said, "Or you could leave the ending unwritten." The guarded survivor steadied her breath and said, "The ending is already written on someone else's hands." The reluctant fire starter stared at the riser numbers and said, 3, 6, 9. He liked patterns. The steady anchor nodded toward the door and said, "Read it under the emergency light." Under the emergency light the paper opened with a sigh, and the guarded survivor said, "It is his handwriting, and it is wrong." The warm comforter scanned the slanting lines and said, "The message is simple and the meaning is not." The reluctant fire starter tapped the rail with a pencil and said, "Read the last line first." The steady anchor closed the stairwell door and said, "If this is bait, we control the bite." The guarded survivor read aloud, "Ask the one who always remembers your drink order." The warm comforter stiffened a fraction and said, "That is a quaint detail with a sharp edge." The reluctant fire starter looked at the guarded survivor and said, "Who memorizes your escapes and your drinks?" The velvet blade descended 1 step, smile still precise, and she said, "Nostalgia is a charming alibi." The guarded survivor's pulse kicked like a drum and she said, "Someone is counting on us to look away." The steady anchor met the warm comforter's eyes and said, "We stay together, and we move now." They emerged into a side lobby where rain drummed the glass, and the guarded survivor said, "He wanted us to hear the storm with him." The warm comforter faced the windows and said, "Storms clean the air or flood the street." The steady anchor scanned the security desk and said, "No guard, no log, that is wrong for this hour." The reluctant firestarter pressed her ear to the cool pane and said, "There is humming out there like a line of power." The velvet blade adjusted a cuff and said, "Electricity reminds us that control is borrowed." The guarded survivor studied her reflection and said, "I look like someone who leaves before the photograph." The warm comforter moved closer and said, "You stay until it is safe to leave." The steady anchor pointed to a side door and said, "Service alley, fastest route to the garage." The reluctant firestarter lifted her sketchbook and said, "I drew the alley last week, and something was missing." The guarded survivor folded the note once more and said, "We go see what absence tried to hide." The service alley smelled of rust and wet asphalt, and the guarded survivor said, "This place remembers every step I once ran to survive." The warm comforter stayed at her side and said, "You are not alone in this corridor of echoes." The steady anchor scanned the dumpster shadows and said, "The path is clear, but shadows stretch where eyes should not." The reluctant firestarter tapped her sketchbook and said, "I drew this alley without the locked door that now waits." The guarded survivor touched the steel handle and said, "Cold like memory, and memory bites when held too long." The velvet blade approached with soft poise and said, "Sometimes doors exist only because someone wants them found." The warm comforter breathed steady and said, "Step back. Let me feel the weight before you push through." The reluctant firestarter crouched and said, "Rust flakes show recent scrape. Someone entered with no care." The guarded survivor gripped the note tighter and said, "If he left this clue, he wanted me to tremble here." The steady anchor motioned toward the corner and said, "Decide quickly. The rain hides but time betrays." Inside the hidden door, the air thickened with mildew and whispers, and the guarded survivor said, "This chamber swallows even my breath." The warm comforter placed a hand on her back and said, "Then I will share mine until you find yours again." The steady anchor clicked on a flashlight and said, "Concrete walls, recent footprints, someone passed here tonight." The reluctant firestarter sketched the marks quickly and said, "The pattern bends where truth bends." The guarded survivor traced the damp wall and said, "Cold as the day I first lost him." The velvet blade brushed her sleeve clean and said, "Cold keeps secrets well, better than warmth." The warm comforter leaned toward the note and said, "The words lead here for a reason." The steady anchor whispered low and said, "Silence is not empty. Silence hides intent." The reluctant firestarter lifted her chin and said, "I can almost hear him tapping on the wall." The guarded survivor pressed her palm flat and said, "The memory breathes here, waiting for answer." They found a wooden chair in the center, scarred and damp, and the guarded survivor said, "This chair remembers restraint and silence." The warm comforter steadied his voice and said, "Sit if you must, but know the seat is heavy with ghosts." The steady anchor circled the perimeter and said, "No cameras, but scraped grooves show movement." The reluctant firestarter scribbled lines in the sketchbook and said, "He was here when the pencil trembled in my dreams." The velvet blade ran a finger over dustless wood and said, "A chair polished by fear becomes a throne of control." The guarded survivor felt her knees weaken and said, "I stood outside once, never knowing he sat inside." The warm comforter lifted her arm and said, "Do not carry a weight that is not yours." The steady anchor peered at the bolts and said, "Tools touched these recently within days." The reluctant firestarter whispered low and said, "His hum would echo against this very seat." The guarded survivor whispered back, "Then he wanted me to feel him here." The reluctant firestarter pointed at the wall etchings, and she said, "He carved numbers with desperate patience." The guarded survivor bent close and said, 3, 6, 9, his rhythm of puzzles. The warm comforter read the grooves and said, "Patterns guide minds trapped in silence." The steady anchor touched the marks and said, "Fresh cuts among the old, someone renewed them." The velvet blade tilted her head and said, "Numbers without context are dangerous prayers." The guarded survivor traced with trembling fingers and said, "He wanted me to find this, to remember." The reluctant firestarter lifted her eyes and said, "He tapped while carving, 3 short beats. The warm comforter sighed steady and said, even in despair, he found order. The steady anchor stepped back and said, these are coordinates, not prayers. The guarded survivor closed her eyes and said, then his ghost leads us still. They emerged from the chamber, the rain louder, and the guarded survivor said, the numbers echo like a riddle in my blood. The warm comforter walked beside her and said, riddles are threads, and threads lead to doors. The steady anchor held the flashlight steady and said, the numbers map to a district near the river. The reluctant fire starter grinned sharp and said, a district where abandoned houses sing with dripping pipes. The velvet blade closed her umbrella with grace and said, water is memory's ink, and the city writes endlessly. The guarded survivor clutched the note and said, he never left me, he only left signs. The warm comforter touched her shoulder and said, signs are invitations, not verdicts. The steady anchor scanned the rain-slick street and said, no tales, no watchers, we are free for now. The reluctant fire starter pointed her pencil and said, freedom is brief, clues are not. The guarded survivor exhaled hard and said, then we follow where the numbers breathe. The river district loomed with warehouses gutted and hollow, and the guarded survivor said, these walls breathe the same damp he once breathed. The warm comforter slowed his steps and said, decay tells the truth that polished rooms conceal. The steady anchor checked the rusted gates and said, chains cut, entry recent, someone wants us inside. The reluctant fire starter tossed her sketchbook open and said, I drew this skyline with missing windows and the drawing matches. The velvet blade smoothed her gloves and said, abandonment is never empty, it only waits for recognition. The guarded survivor pulled the note from her coat and said, the numbers point here, and they never lied to him. The warm comforter brushed rain from his forehead and said, we follow, though every step is weighted with memory. The steady anchor pressed his back against the corrugated steel and said, I go first, danger sits where dust is unsettled. The reluctant fire starter lifted her pencil like a blade and said, danger is louder when no one else hears it. The guarded survivor whispered, then the silence is screaming already. Inside the warehouse, dust motes swirled in flashlight beams, and the guarded survivor said, I can smell the graphite of his old sketches. The warm comforter held the light higher and said, every mark here is a breadcrumb of his truth. The steady anchor tested floorboards and said, tracks here, 3 pairs of boots, 1 lighter recent hours. The reluctant fire starter traced a chalk drawing on the wall and said, he left me shapes that matched my dreams. The velvet blade's eyes flicked to the graffiti, and she said, dreams are convenient witnesses when no one else remains. The guarded survivor trembled at the sketch of numbers and said, he spoke through chalk when his voice was stolen. The warm comforter squeezed her shoulder and said, we hear him still, even when silence pretends to win. The steady anchor lowered his voice and said, not all tracks leave safely, someone stayed behind. The reluctant fire starter tilted her head and said, listen, pencil taps echo like a heartbeat here. The guarded survivor whispered, his memory will not let me escape. They found an overturned filing cabinet rusted shut, and the guarded survivor said, records hide beneath dust, but memory hides deeper. The warm comforter bent to lift and said, paper does not rot if it carries a secret worth keeping. The steady anchor forced the drawer open and said, folders intact, no mildew, sealed plastic. The reluctant fire starter yanked a sheet free and said, this is his handwriting, jagged, unfinished. The velvet blade examined the ink and said, a confession drafted but never signed. The guarded survivor read trembling words and said, he blamed himself for vanishing. The warm comforter steadied the page and said, he wrote guilt, not truth, and guilt deceives the wounded. The steady anchor snapped his head up and said, footsteps outside too heavy for rain. The reluctant fire starter shoved the page inside her jacket and said, then the secret travels with me. The guarded survivor held her breath and said, the walls are listening now. The sound of boots echoed sharp, and the guarded survivor said, someone hunts us like prey inside these bones. The warm comforter whispered low and said, then we move as one heartbeat, never fractured. The steady anchor pushed them toward a back stairwell and said, steel steps down, exit through shadows. The reluctant fire starter tightened her grip on the page and said, he told me once in dreams, never trust the stairs. The velvet blade's gaze sharpened and she said, dreams and warnings overlap when guilt writes them. The guarded survivor swallowed hard and said, yet we must move, silence has turned to chase. The warm comforter pressed her arm and said, we will not be broken by noise. The steady anchor listened with eyes closed and said, 2 men, trained, moving in formation. The reluctant fire starter kicked a can down the hall and said, then let the noise chase them instead. The guarded survivor whispered, we run where absence waits. They burst into the loading dock where rain drummed hard on tin, and the guarded survivor said, the storm hides us but does not forgive us. The warm comforter held her close and said, forgiveness is a dream, survival is truth. The steady anchor locked the dock door behind them and said, time is brief, but we bought silence. The reluctant fire starter flipped open her sketchbook and said, he drew this dock, even the broken crane years ago. The velvet blade smoothed her soaked sleeve and said, he planned for us to walk where he once bled. The guarded survivor studied the cranes through rain and said, he marked the map with scars, not ink. The warm comforter whispered near her ear and said, then scars guide better than roads. The steady anchor checked the horizon and said, headlights sweep closer, pursuers will not wait. The reluctant fire starter tucked the sketch and said, then the story continues where rain writes its own. The guarded survivor breathed hard and said, justice walks into the storm with me. The storm lashed the riverfront as they took shelter beneath the half-collapsed canopy, and the guarded survivor said, he left us here to face the truth that drowned with him. The warm comforter draped his cardigan around her shoulders and said, truth survives, even when voices sink beneath the waterline. The steady anchor unfolded the damp page and said, coordinates shift, but this second number points to the river intake. The reluctant fire starter traced the ink and said, he used the river as his last notebook. The velvet blade raised her chin and said, water buries what memory refuses to release. The guarded survivor shivered and said, he was taken from me here, where the humming died. The warm comforter breathed steady and said, then tonight, we listen for the same hum. The steady anchor pressed the page flat against a railing and said, this is not just a map, it's an admission. The reluctant fire starter clutched the edge and said, he wrote it, knowing someone would betray him. The guarded survivor whispered, and that someone stands among us. The warehouse lights flickered alive with sudden hum, and the guarded survivor said, someone else controls this story now. The warm comforter held her close and said, then we keep the thread before it is cut. The steady anchor gripped his flashlight, but found it useless and said, electricity erases shadows but builds traps. The reluctant fire starter sketched quickly and said, I saw this light in a dream, bright then gone. The velvet blade's lips curled faintly, and she said, dreams are warnings the guilty never heed. The guarded survivor felt her chest tighten and said, he knew these lights would reveal betrayal. The warm comforter rubbed her arm and said, do not collapse. Strength exposes deceit. The steady anchor stepped toward the breaker panel and said, this power came from inside, not the grid. The reluctant fire starter hissed and said, inside means one of us. The guarded survivor whispered, then the betrayal breathes in this circle. A hidden hatch yawned open in the floor with rusted hinges, and the guarded survivor said, he left more than numbers, he left a grave or a door. The warm comforter steadied her waist and said, a door leads forward, a grave pulls us down. The steady anchor crouched at the edge and said, the ladder's new, no rust, someone has used this path. The reluctant fire starter peered into the dark and said, it smells of chalk and wet iron. The velvet blade's eyes narrowed, and she said, iron is memory's cage, and cages always have keys. The The guarded survivor closed her eyes and said, "He wanted me to find what I feared to face." The warm comforter whispered gently and said, "Fear shows the path to truth." The steady anchor gripped the ladder and said, "We descend in silence, one by one." The reluctant fire starter pressed her sketchbook shut and said, "This descent is drawn already." The guarded survivor whispered, "Then I will not turn away." Beneath the hatch they entered a corridor lined with faded murals, and the guarded survivor said, "He painted his silence in colors unseen." The warm comforter brushed dust from the wall and said, "Even silence speaks when pigment remains." The steady anchor scanned the floor prints and said, "These tracks are recent, too fresh for ghosts." The reluctant fire starter ran her finger over the paint and said, "It matches the sketches I drew before I knew him." The velvet blade tilted her head and said, "Art is confession when words are denied." The guarded survivor trembled at the mural of numbers and said, "He left the truth on stone where no judge would look." The warm comforter exhaled steady and said, "And here we listen without verdicts." The anchor leaned forward and said, "The same hand painted and carved, same intent." The reluctant fire starter whispered, "Then his ghost is both artist and prisoner." The guarded survivor whispered, "And his jailer still walks above." At the corridor's end, a sealed door bore the name carved deep, and the guarded survivor said, "It is his name, etched like a wound." The warm comforter steadied his breath and said, "A name carved is a plea, not a monument." The steady anchor traced the letters and said, "Freshly cut edges, not decades old." The reluctant fire starter pressed her forehead to the door and said, "He wanted to be found, not remembered." The velvet blade stepped forward with cold grace and said, "Sometimes names are carved by enemies, not by friends." The guarded survivor clenched her fists and said, "This is not memory, this is a message." The warm comforter pulled her gently back and said, "Then we read it together, not alone." The steady anchor's eyes flicked to the others and said, "This proves betrayal came from within." The reluctant fire starter whispered, "We carried the traitor here." The guarded survivor whispered, "Then the liar has been guiding us all along." The sealed door groaned open on hidden hinges, and the guarded survivor said, "He carved his truth into the stone, waiting for my eyes." The warm comforter steadied her step and said, "Truth that waits this long will cut when it is lifted." The steady anchor drew a sharp breath and said, "This chamber was built for silence, but someone listened here before." The reluctant fire starter darted forward and said, "The air smells of graphite, chalk still fresh." The velvet blade raised her gaze with calm precision and said, "A room like this is not memory. It is confession." The guarded survivor's pulse hammered as she said, "His voice fills this darkness, even without him here." The warm comforter held her hand and said, "If his voice guides us, we must not falter." The steady anchor's shoulders stiffened and said, "This was no prison. It was a workshop for lies." The reluctant fire starter traced the floor symbols and said, "They match my sketches, every line exact." The guarded survivor whispered, "Then he lived long enough to leave me this map." The floor symbols aligned with the note's edges, and the guarded survivor said, "This is the truth he wanted buried." The warm comforter placed the note carefully and said, "It completes the circle he started." The steady anchor leaned close and said, "This circle is no map, it is an accusation." The reluctant fire starter gasped and said, "Look, his handwriting calls out a name." The velvet blade stepped forward smoothly and said, "Names etched in shadows carry little weight." The guarded survivor trembled and said, "It is not a shadow, it is your name." The warm comforter pulled her gently back and said, "Speak only when you are certain." The steady anchor's jaw clenched as he said, "The letters are precise, not chance." The reluctant fire starter whispered fiercely and said, "It names the steady anchor." The guarded survivor's eyes widened, and she said, "The betrayal has always walked beside us." The steady anchor rose with shadowed eyes, and the guarded survivor said, "You guided me here to bury me in his grave." The warm comforter's voice cracked as he said, "You were our constant, and now you stand accused." The steady anchor's lips tightened, and he said, I sacrificed him to protect all of you, and I would again. The reluctant fire starter slammed her sketchbook shut and said, Protection does not carve names in stone. The velvet blade's calm never faltered, and she said, even loyalty decays when fear eats at the edges. The guarded survivor's chest ached, and she said, You broke us with your silence. The warm comforter stepped forward with sorrow and said, Your betrayal was dressed as devotion. The steady anchor's eyes hardened, and he said, Without me, none of you would have survived the first night. The reluctant fire starter hissed, Survival is not the same as justice. The guarded survivor whispered, And justice is what he died for. The chamber shook with thunder from above, and the guarded survivor said, Even the storm cries out against you. The warm comforter pressed her closer and said, The truth stands even when walls fall. The steady anchor's fists trembled, and he said, You do not know the choices I carried. The reluctant fire starter snapped her pencil in half and said, I know lies when they bleed through paper. The velvet blade leaned into the lantern light and said, He betrayed once before. Betrayal repeats like a song. The guarded survivor shook with grief and said, You made me chase shadows when you held the torch. The warm comforter's voice rose firm and said, You will answer now, not tomorrow. The steady anchor's eyes darted to the hatch, and he said, You cannot bind me in this place. The reluctant fire starter lunged toward the door and said, Then I will draw your escape closed. The guarded survivor whispered, The storm carries no refuge for liars. The confrontation reached its edge, and the guarded survivor said, You will not silence him again through me. The warm comforter's eyes burned as he said, We choose now between chains or freedom. The steady anchor's voice cracked, and he said, I did it to keep the velvet blade from winning. The reluctant fire starter shouted and said, But she still stands untouched beside us. The velvet blade smiled faintly and said, I win because you argue, not because I move. The guarded survivor raised her voice and said, His memory binds us stronger than your betrayal. The warm comforter clenched his fists and said, We end this here, no further running. The steady anchor stepped back with despair and said, Then judge me as you judged him. The reluctant fire starter lifted her sketchbook like a weapon and said, His ghost judges you first. The guarded survivor whispered, And his ghost speaks through me. The chamber's silence cracked beneath the storm's echo, and the guarded survivor said, We carry his truth beyond this stone. The warm comforter steadied his breath and said, Truth does not vanish when it is spoken together. The steady anchor slumped against the wall and said, My choices chained me long before you found me. The reluctant fire starter tightened her grip on the sketchbook and said, Chains do not erase the mark of betrayal. The velvet blade tilted her head and said, Justice bends when loyalty breaks. The guarded survivor's voice shook but firmed as she said, He trusted me to rise when all else failed. The warm comforter reached for her hand and said, Then rise with him, not against him. The steady anchor closed his eyes and said, I would change nothing, though it damns me. The reluctant fire starter hissed, Then damnation belongs to you alone. The guarded survivor whispered, We leave your chains here, but we take his name with us. The hatch above groaned with rushing rainwater, and the guarded survivor said, The world above waits for truth to surface. The warm comforter pressed the lantern higher and said, Then light climbs with us, not shadows. The steady anchor's voice broke as he said, Do not carry me with you, I am already buried here. The reluctant fire starter spat sharp words and said, Buried or not, your name stays carved. The velvet blade brushed dust from her sleeve and said, Carvings mean little without those who remember. The guarded survivor's chest ached as she said, I remember, and memory is enough. The warm comforter steadied her shoulders and said, We walk with memory, not with chains. The steady anchor lowered his head and said, Go before the storm erases even this chamber. The reluctant fire starter snapped her book shut and said, The storm will not erase what I drew. The guarded survivor whispered, Then we carry him into the storm. They climbed into the storm-washed dock, and the guarded survivor said, Rain carries his memory across the city. The warm comforter shielded her with his arm and said, "Memory becomes truth when shared aloud." The steady anchor remained below, his voice faint as he said, "Leave me in the silence I deserve." The reluctant fire starter slammed the hatch and said, "Silence is yours, but truth is ours." The velvet blade raised her umbrella against the storm and said, "Truth scatters in wind, unless anchored." The guarded survivor turned to her and said, "Anchors can drown just as they hold." The warm comforter pressed forward through sheets of rain and said, "We walk until the storm bends." The reluctant fire starter lifted her sketchbook skyward and said, "The rain will ink these pages forever." The velvet blade's eyes narrowed and she said, "Pages rot when soaked." The guarded survivor whispered, "But ghosts never rot." Headlights cut through the storm's veil, and the guarded survivor said, "The world will question what we carry." The warm comforter's jaw hardened and he said, "We answer only with his truth, not theirs." The reluctant fire starter scrawled furiously, even in the rain, and said, "I draw before memory twists." The velvet blade stepped into the beam of light and said, "Truth without proof is only theater." The guarded survivor's heart clenched and she said, "Theater still moves the soul." The warm comforter guided her toward the headlights and said, "Then we let them see our scars, not our chains." The reluctant fire starter pointed her dripping pencil at the velvet blade and said, "You fear theater because it unmasks you." The velvet blade's voice cut calm and sharp as she said, "Masks are only lies made visible." The guarded survivor whispered, "Then tonight, we break the mask." As the storm waned, they stood at the river's edge, and the guarded survivor said, "Justice is water. It flows even when dammed." The warm comforter clasped her shoulder and said, "Flow carries us forward, never back." The reluctant fire starter opened her sketchbook to the carved name and said, "I drew his memory so it cannot fade." The velvet blade adjusted her hair with unbroken calm and said, "Memories are fragile, rewritten by grief." The guarded survivor met her gaze and said, "But grief sharpens where lies soften." The warm comforter's voice carried steady as he said, "We will live with scars, not silence." The reluctant fire starter shouted into the river and said, "His hum belongs here, carried by water." The velvet blade's eyes narrowed and said, "Water remembers, but it does not forgive." The guarded survivor whispered, "Then forgiveness is not our purpose. Justice is." The dawn glowed faintly across the river, and the guarded survivor said, "Light exposes scars we carried too long." The warm comforter answered, "Scars guide, not break us." The reluctant fire starter tapped her sketchbook and said, "His name endures, rain cannot wash it away." The velvet blade's lips curved faintly as she said, "Names fade faster than you believe." The guarded survivor whispered, "Not this name." At the courthouse steps, the guarded survivor said, "Justice waits here." The warm comforter said, "We climb with truth, not fear." The reluctant fire starter sketched the soaked columns and said, "Dreams showed me these stones." The velvet blade whispered, "Stone outlasts memory." The guarded survivor said, "But memory outlasts lies." Inside the empty courtroom, the guarded survivor said, "Verdicts failed us." The warm comforter replied, "Truth echoes louder." The reluctant fire starter whispered, "The wood hums with his voice." The velvet blade smirked and said, "Ghosts only haunt the weak." The guarded survivor whispered back, "Weakness turned into strength." Before the empty bench, the guarded survivor said, "We are the verdict." The warm comforter said, "Verdicts carved in courage endure." The reluctant fire starter lifted her sketchbook and said, "He breathes here." The velvet blade replied, "Ghosts bind only fools." The guarded survivor answered, "Better a ghost than a lie." Silence settled, and the guarded survivor said, "He is gone, yet his truth remains." The warm comforter added, "Truth burns longer than lies." The reluctant fire starter pressed her book shut and said, "This holds his heartbeat." The velvet blade murmured, "Heartbeats fade." The guarded survivor whispered, "Not this one."